We're going to talk about early Greece, specifically several early Greek civilizations, the Greek Dark Ages, and then the period that follows, which is known as the Archaic Age. Here are the terms. Go ahead and write them down. We're going to shift westward now, and we're going to talk about Greece. So if you look at this map where that blue arrow is pointing, that is Greece. Just to kind of give you a frame of reference as to its location in relation to where we've been talking about over farther to the east and Western Europe over to the west or the left here on the map. What we see with Greece is that geography is a defining characteristic in several important ways. It's a rugged peninsula that juts out into the part of the Mediterranean Sea that's known as the Aegean Sea. And then the rest of Greek territory consists of lands on the coast of Asia Minor and hundreds of islands. Ancient Greece was on a frontier. The Near East was the area where civilization had grown up. So that's where we've talked about Mesopotamia and the early empires. But Greece itself, like I said, is this peninsula, and it forms a frontier between the Old World and the New World in Europe. So Greece will serve as a border between Europe and Asia. Greece is very much part of the Mediterranean climate zone, an especially temperate environment. The Mediterranean is really just a large, shallow inland lake, and it moderates the climate. So it's hot in the summer, but not terribly humid, and it cools off in the winter. And this is a rich, fertile climate. Life is easy in many ways in terms of human survival. It also means, because it's got this pleasant temperate climate, that people spend a lot of time outdoors. And that's really important in developing a social life and culture in countries of the Mediterranean. So you have all this outdoor socializing in public places. And we're not generally going to see enormous grand homes or structures, but instead we're going to see a lot of public spaces where the people can interact. And then we have the sea. Greece is a land surrounded on all sides by the sea. And when you look at the Greek islands, you see people who grew up around the sea. They're always in contact with the world around them. And this idea of living so close to the sea created a pretty special environment. The sea makes it easy to travel, not only among the islands, but also to go outside of Greece. And the Mediterranean was a giant highway of sorts that led in all directions. You can contrast that with the Nile, where you could go up and down, but not out. The Greeks, as we'll see, seldom settled far from the sea. Also, we have the land itself. It's a land of rough mountains and narrow valleys with no navigable rivers. Because it has all these mountains, it means the people are separated, divided into a number of different regions. And so what that means is that they're not going to ever really unify. Instead, they're going to form their own separate societies. We know that there were people in what's now Greece early on. There were Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies like every other area. And we see evidence of the same sort of changes during the Neolithic Revolution that took place in the Near East. It's thought that they probably took place a little later, and that maybe the ideas originated in the Near East, but we see basic technology emerge, cities emerge, domestication of animals, and so forth. And this early culture in the Neolithic period in Greece develops gradually into a Bronze Age people, although these early people are not necessarily the people we consider to be the Greeks. We don't have any information about an alphabet or language system, but there's reason to suspect that these are not the same people who come in later. We see larger buildings and evidence of some sort of government in some of these early settlements. We also see religious ideas being expressed in art. And so, just to kind of reiterate what I said a moment ago, as I say here, the Mediterranean Sea, the mild climate, because of those things, you've got Greeks who travel. They become traders, colonists, even pirates. You've got a cosmopolitan people because they're coming into contact with other people and cultures. You've got the irregular coastline. The interior is influenced by the development of fiercely independent city-states, and that's because of the geography. And here you see one of those outdoor spaces I mentioned. This is the agora, or the marketplace, and every city-state would have had one of these, usually at the center, and this was the gathering place. People came here to shop, but also to discuss the news, to discuss politics, to talk, to share ideas. It's at the agora that people like Socrates are walking around, picking people's minds. We see the ideas of philosophy emerging, and so forth. Crete is the largest of the Greek islands and the furthest south, so it exists on the edge of the Greek world. And if you look at this map, you see Crete down there at the bottom. Directly south of Crete, about a 3-day sail back then, is Egypt. And Crete was a good crossing point for contact between the Greek world and the world of the Near East. We know that Crete developed much like the rest of Greece, and at some point around 2000 BC, it emerged as a literate society. The principal city and the capital of Minoan Crete was Knossos, which contained a magnificent palace. And there's a number of sites, including Knossos, where excavators have found large settlements that house the government, which we assume was a monarchy. And what you see here is a reproduction of the palace at Knossos. We know that these cities, especially Knossos, were administrative centers where crops and local products were gathered and redistributed, similar to what I mentioned earlier with the Hittites. And they were very complex structures. Now, the later Greeks did not know much about this culture, but they had a myth of a king named Minos. And that's where the name Minoan comes from. According to a myth that the early Greeks told, King Minos had a wife who gave birth to a son. But there was a problem, because their son was half man and half bull, and he was known as the Minotaur. So Minos had him imprisoned in a great labyrinth. And according to Greek mythology, and there's several versions of this story, but according to one of the versions, the Minotaur needed food, needed to be fed, and so tribute came in the form of young people who came and were sacrificed to the Minotaur every year. Well, perhaps this myth has its origin in a folk memory of a complex palace structure, which the Greeks remembered as being the center of this kingdom. Archaeologists have found things that strikingly remind them of the Minotaur, including stylized bull horns. And the palace itself, the remains have been found, and it seems to have actually been laid out like a labyrinth. And it's believed that that might have possibly been as a defensive measure. Here you see some of the remains of the actual palace at Knossos, and it's clear that these people were sophisticated builders and architects. They designed their palaces to have light and air. They had sanitation drains and easy access to water. In fact, the palace at Knossos was huge. It had rooms for the royal family, religious shrines, banquet halls, and working areas for the artisans. And one remarkable aspect of Minoan life was its plumbing. At Knossos, pipes carried water for bathing, and they even had a flush toilet with pipes. So this was a pretty amazing and advanced civilization. And here you see the remains of the throne room. Now, they also had a very well-developed artistic system. Frescoes are found throughout the palace system, and these are like paintings on the walls. And life for the Minoans seems to have been very pleasant. Wall paintings in the king's palace show a lively people with a love for athletic contests and festivals and stylish dress. And the flowers and fish and animals in Minoan paintings tell us that the people loved the beauty of nature. Here you see a piece of Minoan art, a bull's head. For whatever reason, the bull played a very prominent part in Minoan society, maybe hearkening back to the myth of the Minotaur. And here you see another example of a fresco. And here you see an example of their favorite sport, bull jumping, where they would literally leap over a bull. And again, the bull jumping, which also is evidence of their athleticism. So their paintings tell us a lot about their life. The paintings suggest that women appeared freely in public and may have enjoyed more rights than women in most ancient civilizations. There's plenty of evidence that this was an important administrative center. Other evidence suggests that this system stretched over surrounding islands as well, and that Minoan Crete was a great sea power with a navy. And they were primarily a mercantile people, so they were mainly engaged in overseas trade. It's actually believed that the Minoans had an extensive trade network, that they traded with mainland Greece, Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and as far westward as Spain. They exported things like timber, food, wine, olive oil, wool, and cloth. And they imported things like copper, ivory, silver, gold, and other raw materials. Lack of fortifications around the cities suggests that they didn't need defenses, and it indicates a trusting and interdependent relationship with other cities in this area. So they were peaceful. They had no need for walls. Unfortunately, that peaceful outlook is going to change for them when some other people arrive on the scene. We find Minoan art in other areas, which suggests they sent out colonies, and the Minoans were the first people in their part of the world to develop writing. We call it Linear A, and you see an example of it here. And it's called that because it's sort of linear in the way it's written, but it has not been deciphered. We can make guesses based on how it looks, and it looks like some sort of record keeping, but we don't know what language they spoke. The Minoans are considered to be the first European civilization. But what happens to them? Well, there's several theories, but the predominant one is that there was this earthquake under the sea that resulted in a volcanic eruption that covered much of the island in ash. And then, that damaged their crops and so forth, led to famine, weakened the people. This then was followed by a mainland invasion by a group of people known as the Mycenaeans. And what we do know is that this flourishing culture came to an end by around 1400 BC. So goodbye, Minoans. So the Minoans were pretty advanced, but the rest of Greece wasn't participating in this. And it seems that around 2000 BC, there was an invasion of the mainland by a new people from the north. And there's a lot of guesswork here. We know that there was destruction in Greece during this time period, and we know that a new culture comes in. Part of the evidence is a different style of pots. And we know that these were the first Greeks, developing into a people who spoke the Greek language. And Greek is in the Indo-European family of languages. We also know that once these people got down into Greece, there was actually some movement backwards. They reversed some of the development and were more nomadic and village-based until around 1600 BC, when something new emerges at the city of Mycenae. And here you see a map showing just the mainland of Greece. And here you see another map showing the various, what they called palace states. And you can see Mycenae on there. And we know that Mycenae is a city that's going to emerge to dominate the Greek mainland. And they were called palace states because they were basically like kingdoms ruled by kings. And the city-state of Mycenae is going to emerge, and it's going to dominate Greek civilization for about 300 years. And it provides the birth of Greek civilization as we know it. Much of what we know about Mycenaean civilization comes from Greek mythology, which told stories of the Greek Dark Age. And the Greek Dark Age was a 400-year period of cultural impoverishment. And one of the principal stories from this period was about the Trojan War. And this was a war that was to have been fought from 1240 to 1230 BC. Most of the information that we have about the Trojan War comes from epic poetry that was written around 700 BC. So it's distorted by 400 years of oral tradition. Homer was a Greek, a poet, and supposedly blind. And he told the story of the Iliad. And this is based on oral tradition and myths and legend, but the story gives us a notion about how early Greeks viewed their gods. We see that the gods had very human characteristics and they dabbled in the lives of the humans. In fact, Homer says that the Trojan War was actually due to the gods and that it started as a disagreement at a wedding feast. So there's different versions of the story, but supposedly there's this big wedding feast being held in Mycenae. And it's being hosted by the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon. And all the other kings from the other palace states were there as guests. And one of them was Agamemnon's brother-in-law, the king of Sparta, Menelaus. So Agamemnon promised to award a prize to the most beautiful woman there, and the prize was a golden apple. So there's going to be this beauty contest. And of course, all the women and all the goddesses want to participate, but it led to a lot of jealousy among the goddesses. The judge of the contest was the Prince of Troy, Paris, who was also a guest. Now, one of the goddesses had not been invited to the wedding, and this is Aphrodite, but she wanted that golden apple more than anything. So she decided to bribe her way into the contest. She bribed Paris, the judge. She promised him, look, you get me in this contest, you give me that golden apple and proclaim me the winner, and I will give you anything your heart desires. Well, what his heart desired was Helen, a young woman who happened to be married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. So, but she did like Paris. So Paris is like, okay. So he judges the contest, awards the apple to Aphrodite. Then he takes Helen and they run off together back to Troy after robbing the royal treasury. So this is the incident that starts the Trojan War. It's been said that Helen had a face that launched 1,000 ships. That's because Menelaus, he wants his wife back. He aligns with Agamemnon to fight Troy with an international army, including 1,000 ships. And so the Trojan War begins. And initially, the war went badly for the Greeks, and it looked like they would lose to Troy. So the gods intervened and tried to help. So here you can get an idea of the locations of these various city-states. So you can see Mycenae on the Greek mainland, and then across the sea and up to the northeast, you see Troy. And the war goes very badly, as I said, for the Greeks. And it actually looked for a while like they were going to lose this war to Troy. And one reason it was so difficult for them was that Troy at that point was one of the heaviest fortified cities in the world, and the Greeks just couldn't get inside the city walls. So the gods come up with an idea. The gods are like, hey, here's what you need to do. Build a horse as an offering to the Trojans. Hide your soldiers inside the horse. Leave it at the city gates. The Trojans will bring it inside. And then, under cover of darkness, bring your soldiers out. And that's exactly what the soldiers did. They come out under cover of darkness. They open the city gates. They let the rest of the Greek army in. And the Greeks end up defeating Troy, burning the city to the ground, killing all the men, and enslaving the women. Helen tries to hide, but Menelaus finds her and brings her back to Mycenae. We don't know exactly what happened to her back home. Homer says this indicates that the gods favored the Greeks. So I ask, how much, if any, of this can be believed? Well, we know that there was a real Trojan War, but that Homer has really romanticized it. We also see in the story the gods' interference with the events of men, and that reflected the belief of the early Greeks, that the gods were always meddling in their affairs and interfering. Well, after their victory in this war, the Greeks began to regard themselves as different, distinct from the Eastern world. So people used this event as a catalyst to turn towards a truly Western culture because they had beaten the Eastern world. And it used to be, for years, that the story of Agamemnon and the conflict with Troy and Achilles as told in the Iliad was just all a myth. Nobody believed that this was real history until a little more than a century ago. Heinrich Schliemann was a German businessman, and he grew up just idolizing the Iliad. He knew this book backwards and forward. He grew up believing, the more he read it, that these stories weren't just fantasy, but they were actually based on fact. So he grows up, becomes a very successful businessman, very wealthy, and then ends up using a large portion of his fortune to go and prove that many of the events in the Iliad were true. He was a non-professional archaeologist, and this is at a time, this is the late 1800s, this is at a time when archaeology is a brand new field. So he wants to find this civilization. And what he did was he used clues in the Iliad to track down the potential locations of Troy and Mycenae. So first, he finds Troy in 1870, spends several years excavating there, and then we'll find Mycenae. Troy is located in what's today Turkey, and so he had to get permission from the government in order to dig there, and he got the permission, but he had to agree to hand over any artifacts that he found to the Turkish government. So he agrees, and they begin their excavations. And lo and behold, he uncovers what looks to be the remains of an ancient city, and it turns out to be believed to be the city of Troy. And here you see an aerial version of the city today, the remains of it. And here you see a portion of the excavations. And what's really interesting is that he actually discovered that there were numerous layers to the city of Troy. And the first several layers he looked at actually did not line up with the dating. And so at first the thought was, well, okay, maybe this really isn't Troy. But then he actually had a partner he was working with, uncovered more and more layers, and they found a layer that showed evidence of a great fire, and that was dated to right about the time the Trojan War would have occurred. Schliemann also found many, many treasures at the location of Troy. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that the Turkish government asked that he hand anything over to them, everything over to them. Sadly, he did not do that. He actually absconded with a lot of these treasures and used them, some of them, to fund quite a nice life for himself and his wife in Europe. He became the toast of European society for a while, but it also meant that his name was pretty much mud in archaeological circles for quite some time. Now he will eventually hand what remained back over to the Turkish government. But these treasures were sometimes called the treasures of Priam. Priam was the king of Troy. Well, Schliemann wasn't done. He'd found Troy, but he was determined to find Mycenae. And so he ends up going back and excavating several sites mentioned by Homer. He uncovers tombs and pottery and ornaments and the remains of palaces of what had up to that point been a lost Greek civilization. And what he ends up finding is the ancient city of Mycenae. And Homer had written that the center of Greek power was at Mycenae. And here you see the famed Lion's Gate, which Homer talks about. This was the entrance to the city. And here you see Schliemann himself with the Lion's Gate at the entrance to Mycenae. He also found a golden mask presumed to portray the face of King Agamemnon, the most famous ruler of Mycenae, and the king who led the Greeks during the Trojan War. And here you see that mask. Now, later it was determined that it actually is dated at a later period than when Agamemnon would have actually lived, but it's still a remarkable find. The Mycenaeans were an enormously powerful and wealthy group of people. And what has been discovered is that they had contact with Minoan Crete as well as the Middle East and Egypt. But this is a culture that's very different from Minoan Crete. For one thing, it was very warlike, and you can see that in the art. In Minoan art, there are a lot of marine images, plants and animals. They were a peaceful people, and so we don't see any images of war or weaponry or fighting in their art. So here you see some examples. So here's some Minoan art. Another example of Minoan art, a beautiful, calm seascape with marine life. And here's an example of Mycenaean art. Do you see the difference? And this is the norm for Mycenaean art. Mycenaean art focuses on war, on hunting, on warriors. And here you see another example. In fact, the Mycenaeans almost seem to have been obsessed with defense and warfare. And here you see the remains of some of their swords. So what else do we know about the Mycenaeans? Well, like the Minoans, they were sea traders. They reached out beyond the Aegean to Sicily, Italy, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. They learned a lot of new skills from the Minoans, including the art of writing. They also absorbed Egyptian and Mesopotamian influences, which they passed on to later Greeks. The Mycenaeans lived in separate city-states on the mainland, and in each of them a warrior king built a thick-walled fortress from which he ruled the surrounding villages. And wealthy rulers gathered just hordes of treasure, including fine gold ornaments that archaeologists have unearthed from their tombs. Mycenae was not quite as extensively organized as the Minoan palaces, but we do see evidence that people were being organized to build these great tombs and cities, which required a lot of skill and effort. So it appears to be a system that served their kings very well. And here you see an aerial view of the remains of the city of Mycenae. And here is a reproduction. You can see the walls around the city. You can see it dominated by the palace, and then the various other buildings. You see the artist quarters, residences. Now, not every single person would have lived within the palace walls, but it would have been mainly the upper classes. And then here is another view of the reproduction. And like I said, they seem to have been obsessed with defense, and they not only had walls around their cities, the fortifications, but they had a series of walls, and this is the remains of one of those. The Mycenaeans also developed a writing system, which scholars called Linear B, and that's because it appears to have been based off the earlier Minoan system. So they seem to have learned it from the Minoans on Crete, but they adapted it for their own culture. And we have deciphered Linear B. It's actually an early form of Greek. And it's also clear as documents are deciphered that these people had an administrative system. We see lists of goods, chariots, textiles, and so on. So we get a picture of an organized bureaucracy, but there is no literature. So all of the writing pertains to the government or trade or business. We have indirect information that these people worship the same gods as the later Greeks, and culturally, they are the ancestors of the later Greeks. So what ends up happening to them? The mystery of this culture is that it disappeared almost entirely. We see great disruption, not just in Greece, but throughout the Middle East. If you recall, I mentioned something called the catastrophe that began around 1200 BC over in the Near East. And the catastrophe caused the fall of numerous civilizations. And that included the Hittite Empire and many others. And whatever caused these disruptions appears to have hit Greece as well, just happened a little later. As they entered the Dark Ages, all the Greeks remembered was the myth of the Trojan War, when the city-states banded together to go rescue Helen and their ultimate destruction of Troy. There are some indications and archaeological evidence that there was some invasion, but the later Greeks don't seem to remember anything about it. But there's massive evidence of the unraveling of the culture. When the center fell apart, the outer parts could not hold. And so we see a return to the land. People leave the city-states and go back to the land to farm. Literacy is lost because if you're just struggling to survive, reading and writing isn't that important or necessary. For several centuries, in fact, there were no written records. And that's one reason it's called the Dark Ages, because we see that darkness in the culture. But then what ends up happening is we gradually see them starting to come out of this. And once they start to come out of it, we have a new society that emerges. The new age that emerges is called the Archaic Age. And this is the period when Greek culture really emerges. We see several things in particular emerge that are going to lay the foundation for classical Greece. They are characteristics that are key to understanding how Greek society is totally different from any other that emerged in the Middle East before. So let's start by looking at literacy. Now, as I mentioned, during the Greek Dark Ages, literacy is lost. In fact, Homer, who wrote the Iliad, lived during the Greek Dark Ages. And the Iliad, as I mentioned earlier, was told orally at first, then later written down. But now we enter this Archaic Age, and once again, writing emerges. And the Greeks invent a writing system, an alphabet like that of the Phoenicians. So it's a very different writing style than that of cuneiform or hieroglyphics. It's alphabetic, and that means that it's got a limited number of symbols, letters, much easier to learn. And it means that you don't have to spend years and years mastering the characters, and it's not limited to only a small percentage of the population. So what the Greeks did was they made writing available to everyone, not just the elites, but the entire community. And there's something else that's really important about this. The Greeks did not use this writing just for accounts and laundry lists, but they started writing poetry and literature almost immediately. And this poetry and literature give us a great idea of the values and what's really important about this culture. Another characteristic of Greek society that emerges was the polis. So what was the polis? Well, it's a Greek city-state, but it's not just a city-state. It's different from what we've been looking at. The polises, yes, they were city-states, they were independent of one another, because really the Greeks never managed to overcome that independence and separation. So they're never really going to unify, except in times of extreme crisis. But that's not what makes them unique. Part of makes them unique is what they are not. And for the most part, they are not ruled by kings. Now, this is a world where everybody's ruled by kings or emperors. But the Greeks were the first people to utterly reject the idea of rule by a dynasty. Now, there are a few exceptions. A few city-states kept kings, even though they didn't act like kings. But instead of having a single royal ruler, in the polis, it was believed that the people should rule. So what we see is the beginning of the idea of democracy. Now, it's not a true democracy at first. It's more based on the principle that the important people should rule. So at first, we see the rich, powerful, prosperous families ruling. And they develop what's known as an oligarchy. So we see related clans that shared power. So it's not, as I said, totally democratic, because if you were not in one of these families, you're just out of luck and out of business. But it's also a far cry from having a king, because it kind of lays down the idea that there's some sort of political participation by the people, at least some people, and at least men people. The other thing about the polis is that it's what gives you your identity. So you don't just live there, it's who you are. And your actions, every action, is subordinated to the good of the polis. So everything you do is for the betterment of your polis because it's who you are. The Greeks also revamped their military. A hoplite was a Greek soldier. And here you see hoplites in battle. Going along with this idea, the hoplite is a new special form of fighting developed by the Greeks called the hoplite phalanx. So the way it worked would be that you'd have all these hoplites lining up in these long rows or phalanxes, like 40 or so men across, and they're all lined up like that, and they all have their shields, but they don't hold their shields directly in front of them. They hold their shields out, protecting themselves and their neighbor. So each man's shield would overlap with the shield of his neighbor, and in essence what they would do would be form an impenetrable wall. And the two sides would then go at each other and push and shove until one side broke, and then the broken phalanx was doomed. Well, what makes this so unique is that it's very effective, but that it requires the participation of everyone involved. Everyone has to be disciplined and involved. And add to that, you also have to have money in order to maintain your armor. You don't have to be extremely wealthy, but sort of in what we would consider the middle class. And it meant that the soldiers felt devoted and loyal to their city. And so the idea begins to emerge that, okay, you're one of these hoplites and you're out there on the battlefield defending your city-state, your polis. And because you're laying your life on the line, in essence, for your polis, you should have a say in what happens in your polis. And so what we see happening is the nugget of the idea of democracy emerging. The idea that the people, the men people, should participate not just on the battlefield, but also politically. And so more and more, this idea of political participation took hold and spread. If you're out there fighting for your city, you began to think you have a right to have a voice in how it was ruled. But what ends up happening is that this small, fragmented world was very vulnerable. Darius, the Persian king, thought it would be easy to gobble them up. They obeyed laws individually, meaning the Greeks. They were generally fragmented and disunited, unlike the Persians who were unified. So we see a series of wars in the 5th century BC when a huge Persian army tried to invade Greece. The Greeks met the Persian army on land and at sea, and they defeat the Persian army and the navy. They maintained their independence, and they allowed their culture to flourish. And this is a series of wars called the Persian Wars.